A bunch of us guys were camped out one night up on the Etowah River at the side of the old rope mill. We camped out just below the dam. Now this was an all-night guitar picking, fiddle playing, fish fry type outing, and we talked an awful lot. Typical teenage guy talk. We talked about cars and girls, trucks and girls, sports and girls, motorcycles, and, well, I'm sure you get the picture by now. Now, we had all the fixings for our fish fry except the fish. We had to grapple for them. Now, to grapple means that you catch the fish by hand. That added a degree of difficulty and a sense of adventure to the event, and we felt like it gave the fish a much fairer chance. Now, we grappled on the mill race side of the river across from the place where we were camping. On that side of the river, there were lots of rocks and tree roots and bank overhangs for the fish to get up under. They roll up to the top of the water under this stuff and sleep at night. I bet you didn't know that, did you? Well, they will. All you got to do is just pick them up. The grapple does require a small amount of equipment. It takes one kerosene lantern, one tow sack, and 2 fools. And we had all the necessary equipment. One fella has to hold the lantern and the sack. The other fool gets to get down in the water up to about his chin and reach up under the rocks and roots and grab the fish, pull them out, and drop them in the sack. Now on this particular night, me and this old buddy of mine, BW, was teamed up as usual. Like I said, we couldn't waste time with hooks, lines, and sinkers. The fish had to be hand caught. Now my job was the lantern holder. Believe it or not, I am way yonder too smart than to get down chin deep in the water at night and reach up under rocks and such with my bare hands. There's all kind of things might be hid out up under there besides fish. They could be frogs, eels, piranhas, sharks, Loch Etowah monsters. I ain't reaching up in there. Anyway, BW would, so we was a team. Now I'm standing there about bun deep in the water, holding that kerosene lantern up over my head with one hand and a tow sack in the other, waiting on BW to snag something. And he's down up to about his chin, reaching up under the rocks, pulling out the fish and dropping them in the sack. And we'd been at it a while when all at once he yells, "Snake!" and slings out one of the biggest, ugliest water moccasins I ever saw. And he'd flung it straight back toward me, and it was coming in just about lantern high. The next few seconds put me on the rather short list of folks known to have walked on water. I flung that lantern straight up, dropped the sack, jumped up, turned around, and headed for the bank on the other side. I actually passed the snake while he was still in the air. By the time that snake hit the water, I was standing over by the fire pouring myself a cup of courage. About that time, somebody pointed and hollered, said, "Looky yonder," and I saw the darndest thing I ever seen. That lantern had finally topped out and was starting back down toward the water. Ain't no telling how high it went. Somebody said roosters over in the next county had went to crowing when it went up. They thought the sun was coming up. Well, just as that lantern touched the water, I mean right at the top of the water, the biggest catfish any of us had ever seen came up out of the water and swallowed that lantern, and it was still lit. It made that old catfish glow. We could see him running here and yonder under the water. It looked like a neon light running back and forth. He had little rays coming out of his eyes. He'd come up, stick his head out of the water and open that old mouth, and it looked like the headlight on a motorcycle coming towards you. Ain't no telling how big that fish was. While all this was going on, one of the fellas took his picture. When that little picture came back, it weighed 3.5 pounds. Now, after just a little bit, it got to where the light and the heat from that lantern was drawing in other fish. You know, fish will go to a light at night. That old cat would open his mouth and it'd take him in to eat. He was getting a pretty good meal out of all this. And on account of the heat from that lantern, there was boiling water in that fish's stomach by now, and the fat was dripping off its insides, and it was hot enough to fry it with. Now, the fish he was swallowing, they weren't being boiled or couldn't have been being broiled. Sure weren't being fried. We figured they were just being sort of froled. Every time that catfish would open his mouth to take in some more, a nice mess of done ones would pop out. All we had to do was pick them up. They went right good with our hush puppies and beverage of choice, just had to add a little salt. Well, we near about had everybody fed when that old fish made a terrible mistake. He hit on what he thought was a fish, but it turned out to be a turtle. When he swallowed that turtle down, the shell hit the lantern and busted the globe, turned that little kerosene tank over, the whole shebang blew up, and that's when the lights went out. My first day of school. I believe that certain days are stamped on our memories forever. Some may be happy days, like marriages or births. Some may be sad days, like deaths and funerals. And others are days that stay with us just because of their uniqueness. One of my most memorable days was my first day of school. I had not attended kindergarten, so my first formal school experience was day one of the first grade. I am also an only child, and I didn't know how to play well with others and didn't know how to share. In fact, my mother told me one time that by the time I was about 6 months old, she'd already decided that I was to be an only child. I had talked my mother into not going with me that first day. I think that was sort of a little boy thing. Nobody wants to get hugged in front of the whole school. And we had made that 1.5 mile walk a time or two for practice, and she decided I'd be okay. She didn't seem too concerned about me being able to find my way back home. Anyway, that first day started out just fine. It was bright and warm and sunny, and I was excited about finally getting to go to school. I arrived on time and actually found where I was supposed to be. Now, due to my family's interest, when I got there, I could already do a few things. I could already count to 25. I knew my ABCs, could print my name first and last. I knew my colors, my address, and my phone number. I will admit that it was about the 3rd grade before I could spell Chattanooga, Tennessee, though. Now, my daddy, he said he didn't even see why I was bothering to go, since I already knew everything I needed to drive a truck. That should tell you something about him. Like I said, that first day started out just fine, but it went downhill in a hurry. Before long, the bell rang, and we went to the playground for this great thing called recess. The 2 recesses and lunch quickly became my favorite times of the school day. Anyway, all 6th grades were on the playground at the same time, and I made a terrible social error. I wandered off over into 3rd grade land. I didn't know you weren't supposed to do that. A ball game was being organized, and there was a bat laying there on the ground, and I picked it up. A rather large and much older boy, a dreaded 3rd grader, came up and told me to give him that bat now. I didn't, so he grabbed it out of my hands. And me, not being very wise in group play, I grabbed it right back. He then slapped me across the mouth. I hit him back in the mouth with the bat. The next thing I know, we're being pulled apart and ushered, not very delicately, to the principal's office. The principal was Colonel Geevers, a retired military man, ramrod straight with steel gray hair cut in a severe flat top. You could just look at him and tell there was no foolishness in him at all. You look up the word stern in the dictionary, and they have his picture as an example. Now, I figured I'd won the fight. My mouth wasn't bleeding. But the good colonel took all the joy of victory away in a hurry. I had never had anybody talk to me that way before, other than family. He finally finished and sent us back to our rooms. Now, that was just great. I didn't have a clue as to where my room was. I wandered around a while until a teacher captured me, and she chewed on me a while for being in the hall without a note before finally giving me directions. When I got back to my room, Miss Poindexter chewed on me for being gone so long. This was not going to be a good day. I could already tell. I tried to explain that it was not my fault. Colonel Geaver just kept me too long. She grumbled some, but she finally let it drop and went on to something else. The next event was lunch. We lined up in the hall along the wall and were told not to make a sound as we tiptoed to the lunchroom. It was not really a cafeteria. They used those metal trays with dividers in them, and they were fresh out of the dishwasher and hot. We were not asked what we wanted. The ladies behind the steam table passed the trays down, and we were given a glob of some of everything they had. Now, the only two things I remember being on my tray that day was some runny yellow Jell-O and stewed tomatoes. Those stewed tomatoes got me my second opportunity in less than 2 hours to see the Colonel. Let's just say that he was not pleased to see me, and it was mutual. I did not then, and I do not now, eat stewed tomatoes. I ate the Jell-O first. It was melting pretty fast, and everything else on the tray except the tomatoes. Miss Poindexter walked up behind me and tapped me on the shoulder and said, "We must clean our trays." I just sort of nodded and tried to spread them out a little bit, which is hard to do in divided trays, and she went on to somebody else. In a short while, she was back and rather sternly said, "We are not going to leave the lunchroom and go back to our room until we clean our tray." I'm nodding yes again all the time thinking, and lady, we ain't going to eat these stewed tomatoes either. She finally gave up, stood everybody else up, and marched them off down the hall. In a few minutes, the head cafeteria lady, a rather hefty individual, she wasn't likely to blow away, came up and not very nicely told me that I was keeping her from finishing the cleanup and I better go ahead and eat the tomatoes. She didn't want to be late getting off. By that time, I really didn't care if she ever got home. The next thing I knew, there stood the Colonel, arms folded across his chest, fire coming from his eyes, and I swear, I thought I saw smoke coming out of his ears. He asked me what was the problem. Didn't I know that children in other parts of the world were going hungry? And here I was, not eating all my food. I told him that my mother didn't make me eat stewed tomatoes at home, and I wasn't going to eat them at school either, sir. He snatched me up by the back of my shirt, and away we went to his office. He informed me that he was going to call my mother. Now that was the best news I'd had all day. He pulled my card from the file and he dialed up Miss Nell. You must remember that I only heard one side of the conversation. You also need to know that nobody messed with my mother. Nobody. Especially when it came to her little boy. She might whip me till her arm wore out, but nobody else better even think about laying a hand on me. The Colonel introduced himself, and then he told her about the playground fight, and then about me refusing to eat all my lunch. The conversation, the best I can remember, went something like this. "No, ma'am, he didn't hit the other little boy first. No, ma'am, he didn't sass the teacher about the lunch. He very politely refused to eat the tomatoes. No, ma'am, he's been very polite and respectful toward me. Well, it's just a rule. Ma'am, 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 yes, ma'am. No, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am." He hung up, took a couple of deep breaths, looked across the desk, and asked, "Now then, is there anything else that you don't eat?" He dismissed me and told me to go on back to my room. I knew the way this time. The next thing I remember, the bell rang for afternoon recess. I had barely set foot on the playground till here comes the dreaded third grader and some of his friends. He informed me that I would see more of them as soon as school was out and we were not on school property. Now all of this was said through a rather ugly set of busted lips. I didn't say anything. I just walked off to the edge of the schoolyard and sat down and leaned back against the fence. 2 reasons. Number 1, I was outnumbered. And number 2, I didn't have the bat. I did some serious thinking. And I decided that maybe my daddy was right. I just might not need to stay all day. So I got up and went on home. When I walked in the house, Mother wanted to know what was wrong. I told her that lunch didn't agree with me and that my stomach hurt. She said, "Well, wasn't it nice of them to let you come home?" I didn't bother to try to tell her I hadn't asked to leave. I'd just done it. So, being legally correct, I figured I had not told her a lie. She told me to go lay down and maybe I'd feel better in a little while. And I'm laying there thinking that I just might get away with all this when I heard footsteps. Heavy footsteps on the front porch. I heard a knock on the door, and that's when I got up and peeked around the door jamb and looked down the hall. Mother opened the door, and there stood the Colonel. He'd found me. I didn't have the vocabulary to describe what I felt then, but in later years, the term stark terror seemed to fit that situation pretty good. I listened while the Colonel told her the whole story. The fight, the lunchroom, and then I just disappeared. I listened real close, but he told the truth about it all. No, he hadn't given me permission to go home, nor had any of the teachers. I just left. My mother, bless her heart, thanked him for being concerned about my safety and whereabouts, and she assured him that he would have no further problems with me. I silently agreed because I figured I'd be dead. I jumped back on the bed. I wanted to get under it, but it wouldn't have done any good. You remember I said I was terrified? Well, it was not from seeing the Colonel appear. It was because of what I knew was coming after he left. Now, my mother was not one of those mothers that would say, "You just wait till your father gets home." No, not her. She didn't need any help at all. She came down the hall and stood in the doorway and said without any warm-up at all, "You lied to me." I replied, "Yes'm, I reckon I did." She went on, "You know what that means, don't you?" "Yes'm, I reckon I do." "Well," she continued, "do you want to go cut the switch or do you want me to do it?" I told her to go ahead, that whatever size I brought in wouldn't be big enough to suit her, and then she'd get madder and go cut one that looked like a telephone pole. That made her laugh. I had already learned that if I could get her to laugh, the whippings were not near as bad. Well, she touched me up pretty good. Not for the fight, or lunch, or leaving school, but because I had not told her the truth. Now, the only thing my daddy asked after he was told about my day was, "Did you win the fight?" I don't remember much else about the first grade, except I didn't have to eat the stewed tomatoes that were served at least once a week. And I was the only first grader that the Colonel knew by first name on sight. I tried really hard, and it was some weeks before I had to go back and see him, but I finally did. He just shook his head when I asked him if he was going to call my mother and said no. Now, this has been a little story about one of those days that we have all had and will have again. And over the years, my mother and I had a lot of real good laughs about the Colonel and my first day of school. The Volunteer Fire Department. As I was driving up through town the other day, I met a fire engine and some other emergency vehicles. At the rear of this line of official equipment came a stream of volunteers in their private vehicles, mostly pickups and sport utility vehicles. Some had sirens and warning lights, others just had their headlights on and horns just blaring. This procession reminded me of the volunteer fire department we had in my hometown back during the 1950s. The city I live in now has a corps of paid firefighters and emergency medical personnel, as well as a large group of volunteers. There's even a waiting list of people who wish to join the ranks of this dedicated group. But the department I'm going to tell you about was just a little bit different than what is today's very well-trained organization. Our small-town department only had one piece of rolling equipment, a 1949 Ford truck, a 1.5-ton flatbed with a converted 300-gallon liquid fertilizer tank chained down on the bed. There was no pump on the truck or fire hydrants in town. The water flow was gravity fed, so the truck had to be parked uphill from the fire, if at all possible. If not, about the only thing it was good for was to fill the buckets. It did have a real fire hose, though. That had been purchased from an Army-Navy surplus store. A long brass nozzle was attached and would deliver a pretty good stream of water if the truck was parked far enough uphill. The truck was red and actually had a chrome siren mounted on the roof of the cab. It didn't work, but it sure looked good. 2 red running lights that had been taken off an old motorboat was also located on the top, and they really worked. The original truck horn worked, though, and that was the only warning device it had, other than the busted muffler. On both doors, the city's name and the words Fire Department had been stenciled on with Caterpillar tractor yellow paint, as close to gold as they could find, I guess. Now, that old truck was kept washed and waxed better than any other vehicle in town. It didn't get a lot of use, other than an occasional trial run, the 4th of July parade, and Santa Claus came in town on it every year. But it was a source of pride for our little town. You see, we had the only truck in the county, other than the county seat, and their truck, it wasn't that much better than ours. The firefighting equipment carried on the truck was a mixture of old, new, and worn-out tools from the various volunteers' homes. Picks, shovels, axes, a bunch of buckets. Some of them still had handles on them. A 20-foot length of log chain, and I don't know why, and a stepladder with one hinge made out of baling wire was the extent of the firefighting equipment. We didn't even have a fire extinguisher. The driver would be whoever got to the truck shed first when the town alarm sounded. I actually saw 2 men get into a fight over who would get to drive. They had gotten there at the same time, and while they were rolling around on the ground discussing this, another man ran up, jumped in, cranked up, and drove off. The town alarm was the bell on the Baptist church. The Baptist church was the closest of our 3 churches to the center of town. That bell was the only thing in town that was never messed with as a prank. Everything else in town was fair game, but that bell. If it rang any time other than church time, and we all knew when they were, everybody knew there was a fire somewhere. I say somewhere because there were no cell phones, pagers, walkie-talkies, or 2-way radios in those days to be used to give information. We did have telephones, 2, 3, or 4 party lines, but no emergency communications at all. One day a man came rushing into town, rang the bell, then jumped back in his truck and took off. Nobody knew where to go. He finally came back to the church, told everybody to go on back home. It was too late. His barn had already burned down. As a matter of fact, most things did burn down, in spite of the gallant efforts of our dedicated volunteers. Everyone in town was a volunteer fireman. All it took was the desire to be one. Most of them were very serious about their jobs, some of them not so much. The crew was made up of store clerks, bankers, preachers, mill hands, butchers, grocers, and anyone else who happened to be in town when that bell rung. There was very little, or as in most cases, no training. Sometimes it was right comical to watch a bunch of grown men mill around, yelling out orders to one another as a building merrily blazed away. 2 of these volunteers stick in my memory. They were unique, to say the least. One was the stock and delivery boy at one of our 2 grocery stores. He was about 30 years old and really was a nice guy, just a little slow sometimes. One thing I remember especially about him was that he always wore an old baseball cap pushed up on the back of his head. Some said he slept in it. He had not gone to school very much. Reading and writing were not his strong points. He stocked the shelves by matching the colors and pictures on the cans and cartons. I always thought that was pretty smart. Whenever he was mentioned, folks in town would just sort of nod and say, "That boy just ain't right." No ridicule intended, just a statement of fact. He was our most enthusiastic firefighter. The grocer would let him drive the store's pickup to make deliveries and such, even though no license had ever been considered for this fella. Now, this was not too unusual. A lot of us drove quite a few years before we got old enough to need a license. You had to be 16 to need a license. When that alarm bell would sound off, this old boy would tear out of the back door of the store, still in his apron. The fires were a come-as-you-are event. He'd jump in and crank that old Chevy up and take off as fast as it would go. The horn didn't work on that old truck, so he would turn his cap around backwards so it wouldn't blow off, stick his head out the window, and do a siren sound at the top of his lungs. Sometimes when he'd get to a fire, he'd have to be told to turn off his siren. He'd forget it was on. When the fire truck went out, there'd be a long line of pickups and cars behind it. Looked sort of like a parade. Sounded like one, too. They basically played follow the leader. One time the truck went the wrong direction out of town and had to turn around through the school driveway to go back. You should have seen it. Here was 10 or 12 vehicles roaring through the schoolyard, lights, horns, and one siren, with some children standing on the playground cheering them on. The other individual I recall was a young Baptist preacher we had for a while. Like I said, he was young and not Southern. Either thing made him suspect right from the start. And he never overcame either of these faults as long as I knew him. He got on the bad side of some of the church ladies right off. On the day he and his wife were moving in, some of the deacons' wives took some covered dishes to the parsonage for the new folks' supper. You know, us Southerners can do covered dishes better than any other group of people in the world. You ever been to an old-timey country funeral? We used to go to funerals just to eat. Anyway, when they got there, the preacher's wife had on a pair of shorts. Short shorts. Plus, she'd rolled them up another lap or two. If those shorts had been biblical, she had them up to near about Revelations. Well, that didn't sit too well with our white glove welcoming committee. This fella did try his best to fit in, but it just didn't work. In most folks' opinion, he suffered from the dreaded 3H condition: hapless, helpless, and hopeless. A few weeks after he had arrived in town, the fire bell was rung to announce a fire. Now, he'd been told what to expect, and he joined right in. He followed the crowd to the burning house, and he was determined to do his best. The first thing he did was grab an axe off that truck, jumped up on the front porch, and begun to whale away at one of the windows. I reckon he'd seen him do that in the movies. One of the other men stepped around him, opened the screen door, turned the front doorknob, and walked right on in. The look on that preacher's face was priceless. He'd done it again. While all this was going on, it had been discovered that the water tank on the truck was empty. It was turned around and sent back downtown to be filled. The filling point was at the train depot. There was a water tank there. Now, this was back in the days of steam engines. On the way back to town, 2 or 3 more volunteers had been met, and they turned around and followed the truck all the way to the depot. They thought he'd just gone the wrong way again. There was about as many folks there as was at the fire. The house did burn down. Come to find out, a still in one of the back rooms had blown up and started the fire. When the now much heavier truck finally got back to the fire, it pulled across the front yard so as to get a little uphill and promptly buried the rear wheels in one of the storage pits for the jugs of product the owner of the house had hidden there. The group decided not to let any go to waste, and that fire became one of the happier ones I remember. There was only one other fire engine that I ever had any personal experience with. Now, the city would not let their truck go out of the city limits. One end of town begun to grow and became a community of its own, just out of the city limits. And the merchants and the residents there wanted some fire protection. Finally, one of the business owners in that group bought a used, surplus fire engine from a local military installation during a salvage sale. It was a fine truck, a real fire engine, an American LaFrance. It had pumps and everything, and it was big. The siren, lights, air horns, and bell all worked. It had a swivel mount water cannon on top that put out a tremendous amount of pressure. I was at the first fire it was used on, and the damage from the water pressure was greater than that from the flames. About half the roofing was peeled off that old house before they could get that gun stopped. Also, that truck was really fun to drive. This gentleman's son and his best friend, me, felt obligated to keep that truck in fine running order. This obviously required a test run pretty regular. Now, even though this truck was not supposed to go up into town, now and then it would just happen. Usually Halloween, New Year's Eve, and the 4th of July would deserve at least one round trip up through town, long about midnight, with red lights flashing, sirens screaming, bells ringing, air horns blaring, nearly wake the dead. Masks on and caps pulled down over eyes or bandanas across faces did little to hide the identity of the drivers, but nobody seemed to mind though. And we'd have to turn around in that same schoolyard to go back through and out of town. By then, some folks in their night clothes would be standing out by the road just a-waving us on. I reckon a little excitement at night was okay now and then. Now maybe the next time you see a fire engine or hear a siren, you'll remember some of this and be thankful that some progress has been good.